Will the AI first movement and AI being used for everything ultimately be the end of cloud native and SaaS solutions?
I bet you're going to tell me.
This week, I want to dive into the AWS outage and some questions that I have bouncing around in my head after all of the action that we've seen this last week. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Emma Roloff, and in these episodes of Change in the Wild, I take a look at technology current events and how they relate back to the world of digital transformation, change management, leadership, and emerging technologies. And this week, as I said, I want to dive deep into the AWS outage. If you're enjoying our content, consider subscribing to our channel, giving this video a like, and dropping a comment. We personally respond to every comment that we get because we enjoy having a conversation with you. Unless you are living under a rock, you're probably aware of the fact that on Monday, October 20th, AWS had a substantial outage out of their data center in Virginia. And many of the companies that were operating out of that data center, like Snapchat, the encrypted messaging app Signal, and everybody's favorite AI first company, Duolingo, and many, many others were impacted by this outage. And because of the types of companies that were impacted, the ripple effect was felt around the world. Now, some of these use cases, like Snapchat being out, cool, you can't send a selfie to your friends for a period of time. That's not life or death, right?
Speak for yourself.
But other companies like United reported issues with their app and allowing passengers to access their tickets. That does have some bigger implications, or places like doctors' offices not being able to take appointments. In Amazon's defense, the window of time in which the outage occurred was relatively short, and they got the services back up online as quickly as possible. And since Monday, they have released statements surrounding what they think caused the outage. And it wasn't anything nefarious like hackers getting access to the system.
Look in my little black book of hackers.
They are pointing the finger at faulty automation. According to The Guardian, they released a statement saying that they found a latent defect within their server's automated DNS management system, and that had cascading effects that ended up making the services go down for the period of time that we experienced. And the first question that pops into my mind when I hear that this outage was caused by automation is, what happens as we continue to lean into automation even further? It feels like almost every single day we're hearing stories about massive software companies laying off employees in the name of automating their jobs through the use of AI. But if automation and AI are becoming a central part of how we manage this critical infrastructure and which literally the entire world runs on, what happens if these defects start to become more and more regular, or they're not caught because the automation isn't balanced by the appropriate amount of humans in the loop in their processes?
Where are all the people?
And it goes a step beyond that, because as we look at AI first movements and more companies leaning in the direction of relying on AI for critical decision making, what happens when those services go out because of some sort of automation defect? What happens to the decision making that has been shifted to the technology and away from the humans, and there's no longer as many humans there to keep processes moving in the first place? From an enterprise technology standpoint, raises a lot of questions for me about how companies are looking at disaster recovery, not only from an outages perspective and how much you're getting paid back from AWS when they have an outage, but more around the lines of, how do you continue if the core of your business has been completely cut off? I mentioned the idea of doctors' offices not being able to book appointments. Okay, you can book an appointment a couple of hours later. But what happens when key components of our healthcare system are being run by AI solutions that are hosted in the cloud, and that cloud goes down? Those key components are no longer able to operate. And when you look at things like diagnosing via using AI, or being able to have patients be seen and receive care, all of these things become a lot more serious.
But we need a real doctor here.
And recently on TikTok, I've been having a pretty interesting conversation in the comments with people about being fatigued by subscriptions as a whole. And a movement that I'm starting to see in conversations with companies that I work with. And more companies are starting to kind of like boomerang back to this idea of building proprietary software in house as opposed to going out and purchasing a solution for every problem that they have. And this was a really big topic 10 years ago when I first started selling enterprise technology. There was a lot of conversations of when do I build and when do I buy? And those conversations kind of started to evaporate a little as everything started to move to the cloud. Companies were told that moving onto the cloud helped with things like disaster recovery and made it easier for them to manage and have more uptime. And more companies started moving from offering on-premise solutions that were hosted as at the company into cloud services. And as that movement to the cloud started to happen, we also saw the movement from being able to buy perpetual software licensing to only being able to buy subscriptions. And so companies went through this massive shift from having everything be owned by them as an organization that, yes, they had to pay maintenance for, but they owned the core software product and they were able to host it within their own environment, to everything being hosted in a cloud environment and having a software subscription associated with it. And now we're starting to see specifically that software subscription fatigue start to settle in. And as companies are getting fatigued with those software subscriptions and they're looking at bringing the development of proprietary software in house, if they've already got the development in house, and we start to see things like more outages coming from these cloud services, there's an appeal for companies to bring those software platforms that they're developing on premise and hosting them individually. And I am curious to hear everybody's thoughts in the comments about, as we rely more and more on technology, is the safer bet to have that management in house? Because there's also a whole other conversation about whether companies still have the right talent to build out their own proprietary platforms. Do they have the right talent to manage the infrastructure internally that's needed to host business critical platforms? Because the skill set of IT departments has had to evolve alongside this trajectory of moving towards SaaS solutions in the cloud. And now we don't necessarily have the same people in house in businesses as we once did to be able to manage all of this. In the comments, I've seen some interesting things pop up surrounding the idea that maybe all of these developers that have been laid off by the software companies will come in house and start building solutions directly for the companies themselves. So maybe the same is true with skill sets of people being laid off by software companies being able to come into businesses directly and help manage this boomerang effect back to building solutions in house that are managed on prem. But there's also many questions that come back to the idea of, if we're moving towards AI, do we have the data that's appropriate to build out solutions? But I also think that there's a draw towards proprietary software development when it comes to AI because of questions surrounding data ownership, model ownership, transparency tied to how the model itself works. And I think that there is a really interesting idea here tied to, will AI ultimately bring us back to all of these things that we moved out of in the name of cloud hosted SaaS solutions over the last decade? And is the pendulum shifting back in a different direction? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the subscriptionification of everything. And if you are also seeing this trend of people starting to build versus buy a little bit more. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this idea of, how do we manage disaster recovery in this world full of AI solutions that are hosted in the cloud, with more and more automations coming into how we manage everything? And where do we fit in this big puzzle? And how do you think it's going to start to play out over the next couple of years? As you can tell, I'm really passionate about all of this, and I love having discussions in the comments about your thoughts and your experiences. So drop your thoughts below and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. If you like what you saw, be sure to come back on a weekly basis and subscribe for more expert interviews focused on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.